see that name, Tamás is my family name, and the rest are my given names. Right, so to start this very complex topic that I have announced, which is the question whether there was or there is a fascism after 1945, which of course will bring us to the concept of fascism and the concept of post-fascism, which I developed in an essay that may be known to some of you, that has been published in the year 2000 in Boston Review and translated into several languages, including Serbian and Slovene and others, German, and where I tried to show how some very important elements of fascism can survive in a democratic liberal décor without totalitarian rule and without violence and without terror. So the idea to really enter into the very inner sanctum of fascist thought, I will follow very shortly some thoughts of Carl Schmitt, who has generalized the idea of war. What is, for a legal philosopher, the essence of war? In war, you are permitted legally to kill members of groups other than your own. In subsequent legal arrangements, there were some limitations on this, like the prohibition of killing civilian populations that has been so disregarded during the Second World War that it has not been ever taken seriously again. So the idea of war has gone back to its pre-enlightenment idea, when war is not regulated. Enmity is absolute. The right to kill is absolute in a war if it regards the alien, if it regards the enemy. Now, Carl Schmitt thought that he can generalize the idea of war, that is legal killing, legal limitation of citizenship, legal annihilation of human rights, including the right to life, within given societies. When he speaks about the differentiation between friend and enemy, and when he develops his well-known theory about sovereignty being the right to decide, he has this kind of decision in mind. But in terms of legal philosophy, of course, he's wrong. Because you see, he starts with the Hobbesian idea of absolute enmity and absolute dispensing right of killing and of limiting people's livelihood and people's rights and people's personal autonomy and so on and so forth, which is implied by the idea of war, legitimate killing. But Hobbes considered this, that if this principle is generalized within the interior of a given state society, as being stasis, as being the state of the civil war, which he considered to be the supreme evil. Hobbes thought, and at the beginning Schmitt did too, that one of the aims of legal doctrine would be to prevent civil war from becoming the supreme law of any given society. And at the beginning, he thought, and many did, I won't go into the literature of this, that actually it was the adoption by the socialist movement of the principle of class struggle that was leading to a version of interior conflict that approached the idea of the civil war, and therefore dissolved all the constitutional decencies that separated friend from enemy and war from peace. Now, the radical idea of fascism was that the idea of stasis has to be the foundation of political order, declaring citizens non-citizens in a modern state where citizenship is the basis of political existence means overturning sovereignty. Because we are not living, and nor were the people in the Third Reich, etc., living in any old kind of state. They were living in post-enlightenment modern states where citizenship was declared and was thought to be a general condition of all human beings within any given society. That was basically the radical idea of the French Revolution, in which differences between inner groups in a given society were not considered any longer to be decisive. When the idea of nobility has been outlawed, that of course gave the privilege of political participation and political decision to a given group within a society, then universal citizenship had become the basic principle of modern society as such. So when fascism appears, and I'll tell you very briefly where does it appear, at what point, and what is the absolute necessity for it to appear, is within a post-enlightenment state in which, for example, the Weimar Republic or in the Italian Republic, etc., 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 Chile Republic, etc., universal citizenship have been declared. And even in non-Western countries, in Europe, in 1848 at the latest, universal citizenship has been declared. And restricting universal citizenship, that gives the right of the sovereign to dispose of the inhabitants of a given national territory to be non-citizens, that can indeed have the power to declare them to be non-citizens. That is the kind of absolute power that fascists have declared, and based on determinations that were not political like in other conditions and states of coup d'etat, of civil war, of state of exception, etc., etc., but on biopolitical foundations. And so therefore, fascism was indeed a sort of revolution, a biopolitical revolution that has indeed established an order in which the supreme power had the right to declare, to withdraw, or to have in its gift the right to give or to withdraw citizenship from inhabitants of a given polity. But how did it come to this? Well, fascism has been historically a movement that the original came form, the original stellar form of it, has been described first by Marx in the 18th of Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where, unbeknownst to the public reading Marx, he has been perfectly aware of the dangers of, well, of course, without the terms, of fascism and of Stalinism. The 18th of Brumaire is clarifying the possibility that it is not the class struggle with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that will decide the sort of the West, but it will be the takeover of political power by the state elites and by the state apparatus, leaving capitalism economically unchanged, but confiscating political power from the bourgeoisie. This has happened under the Nazis. And also in the critique of the Gotha program, he was perfectly aware what could happen under an egalitarian dictatorship introduced by socialism. And the bureaucratic rule and the dictatorship based on redistribution and planning, the dangers of that were pretty clearly seen by Marx and by others, of course, but it's, that's the most important tradition for the left, of course, is Marxism. It was seen pretty clearly, and what has indeed happened, fascism has been, of course, a preemptive revolution. The aim of fascism, the world historical mission of fascism, was to prevent Western socialism from materializing. And in this respect, don't forget that fascism has won. There is no Western socialism. There is no Western socialism. Indeed, the prevention or the defeat suffered at the hand of fascists and of Nazis during the two world wars, especially, of course, in Germany, where there was a pretty fair chance of socialism to win, at least a stronger chance than elsewhere, in the West, anywhere, that was successfully presented by the revolutionary energies being colonized by the Nazis and used against the bourgeoisie and against proletarian socialism, both. Political power has been as confiscated from the bourgeoisie as it has been confiscated from the proletariat. But what's the difference? The proletariat didn't have a capital. Capital has not been confiscated from the bourgeoisie, only political power. All the proletariat has had was political power. That was, of course, thanks to organization and to numbers. The sheer numbers of the social democratic and the communist movements and some other more marginal movements and of the trade unions. These were the greatest organized forces a subaltern class has come up with in history. It has never happened before in history that a subaltern class condemned to exercise physical labor to have such a political power and a fair chance of taking power. Also, there has never been in history any subaltern class that had any culture different from folklore. All the subaltern classes of the past had mostly unwritten folkloric cultures. It was the industrial proletariat that first it had its own economic theory, its own sociology, its own philosophy, its own propaganda, its own political parties, its own intellectual, what is called intellectual left, which wasn't free-floating in those times, but it was indeed embedded in the history of the workers' movement. And this created a whole patois, a whole dialect of one of the most important ones historically of the Western culture, and then of the culture of other places as well, basically in the whole world, basically. And so it was the first subaltern class to have cultural power, to have political power, and to have also sometimes military or paramilitary power within societies. It was the greatest threat to hierarchical society ever materialized. It was never anything, we tend to forget after the defeat of the workers' movement what a huge, enormous thing it was and what a threat to traditional societies it represented. And of course, people now mistakenly think that the workers' movement was something egalitarian. Of course, this is nonsense. There were many egalitarian movements, and most of the egalitarian movements are bourgeois movements, and are still bourgeois movements. Today, we still have egalitarian movements, from social democracy to feminism, etc., 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 that are perfectly compatible with contemporary capitalism, that of course try to achieve equality through legislation, through redistribution, through taxation. In other words, leaving capitalism intact and making it more just. That's the idea of bourgeois egalitarianism from the French Revolution. That's okay as it goes. That's still a self-limitation of a dominant class in a hierarchical society. Well, of course, it cannot be ever realized because of the well-known contradictions of the capitalist economy. But in the 1920s and 1930s, it wasn't that. Everybody has realized that the moment of decision, the moment of turn in history has arrived. And that world, the old world, has been saved by fascism. No lesser person, I'm trying not to quote too many thinkers and so on, Friedrich August von Hayek, who was no fascist, who was an ultra-liberal conservative economist, said, because he was a sincere and honest man, like it's very difficult to find today. But those were historical times. He said, we, in spite of all our hatred of fascism, we must be grateful to the Third Reich to have saved Europe from communism. That was exactly the attitude of Martin Heidegger. In a letter to his former friend and pupil, Herbert Marcuse, in 1945, when Marcuse has made some reproaches, about his role in the Nazi regime, he said, yes, maybe it was wrong, but don't forget that we have saved the world from communism. And they did. Because of course, the success of fascism has forced a transformation of the workers' movement that lasts until today. It has made the international workers' movement a nationalist movement. Popular Front, socialism in one country, I don't need to tell you. The radicalism of communism as it appeared until, say, 21, 22, even in the Soviet Union, was incredible. How the great fear of bourgeois societies in the early 20s, if you read the conservative literature of the age, I know it pretty well, about communism and about the Soviet Union and so on, what were they scandalized about? Not about, nationalizations and the proletariat taking political power and economic power and so on and so forth, but this being accompanied by an onslaught on two other fronts. Not only private property, but the family. It was the Soviet Union that first introduced abortion on demand, that has introduced divorce by simply announcing divorce, that legalized homosexuality, etc., 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 etc. So it was, a socialist revolution, and don't forget that the communist movements were like this also in Germany, with the greatest radicality. They had their biopolitical dimension. It was an onslaught against everything that hierarchical societies consider to be essential to the spiritual well-being of man. Okay? Tradition, religion, family, private property, order, a difference between up and down, superior and inferior, and most importantly, and which is at the basis of all this hierarchical symbolic, the contrast between spiritual and physical work. Do not forget that as such old societies as Athenian society, for example, linked citizenship to leisure. Nobody who works for somebody else can be independent. No dependent person can be a citizen. So whoever had to work for a living was not considered to be worthy of the quality of a citizen in Greek societies and in all olden societies. People not really being independent to pursue their wargaming and struggle and nobility of soul and courage and spiritual, philosophical and artistic pursuits were not considered to be wholly human. Whoever has to do physical work to keep to earn his keep, was considered to be a second-rate human being and a non-citizen, not worth, And what did communism say? Communism has attacked the very substance of hierarchical society, which is labor. Marxism is against labor. It's not against, only value and the capital. It's against labor. Labor is, of course, a basic element of capital, and as such will have to be suppressed together with capital. So, it was a total reversal of values, more radical than everything Nietzsche has imagined, and it was a great fear, and also it was, as a result, great fear always results in a great hatred. But the genius of fascism was not only to turn against most radical communism, but also to turn against bourgeois liberalism, and showing, like today, if you wish, showing the populace, showing the audiences that liberalism and Marxism, that capitalism and socialism are different sides of the same medal, of these capitalism and socialism, liberalism and Marxism are both, they said, two different aspects of a godless society, of a society bereft of the spiritual dimension. Because both of these, they said mendaciously, because it's not true of Marxism, they would accept material needs and physical labor and technology, blah blah, all this, to be the supreme mission of man. And of course it is exactly the opposite, it is true. But of course, Marxism was misunderstood before, not by the fascists, but by the social democrats. That wanted shorter hours, greater salaries, an improvement in the human condition in material and also in cultural terms, and of course leisure increased, even if it's not absolute. So it was not a liberation of labor and liberation from labor, but it was an enlargement of a free space for the workers, and the gradual increase in the political power, what it's like. And so increasingly the social message from Fourier and Marx went back to Saint-Simon and to Lassalle, which was indeed, the famous slogan of the International, that from everybody according to his or her capacities and to everybody according to his or her needs. That's not Marx, that's Saint-Simon. That this is something that Marx called feudal socialism. And he was absolutely against it. And he was quoting it as a compromise, because with the social democracy, but that's neither here nor there. And so the fascists have understood quite precisely the danger. And why were they so intelligent? They were made intelligent exactly by the same event that the communists in 1917, 1920 were made clever. It was the First World War. Both the Nazi and the Communist parties were parties of veterans, of war veterans, of young people out from the trenches. Many of them cripples, many of them wounded seriously in the war. These were people who hated bourgeois society with a passion, and with an equal passion. And the Stahlhelm and the SA and NSDAP and so on have understood that to win power and to prevent a class war in which only the proletariat can win, they must turn against bourgeois society. And they took away political power from the bourgeoisie and gave it to their political apparatus, while leaving capitalism intact. But symbolically, capitalism in the Third Reich has disappeared from the public sphere. It wasn't visible. It was the secret of that society, but it wasn't clearly visible. They also pretended that that they, Goebbels explains in a famous article, why are they socialists? And why is social democracy and communism false socialism? Because, of course, the false socialism of the communist and social democratic parties and trade unions ignores the secret force that makes the hierarchical society non-hierarchical, that makes spirit into matter, that makes chastity into debauchery, that makes noble aspirations in the pursuit of money, of course, the Jew. And so transformation of the class struggle into a cultural war is the main characteristic of fascism. And it remains so. Race war and cultural war are identical. Race was never taken literally, even by the Nazis. Like today, of course, racism is a complex phenomenon, and the cultural wars are complex phenomena. And again, even today, contrary elements are linked eclectically but extremely efficiently by the contemporary post-fascist movements and political apparatuses and so on and so forth. But speaking of classical fascism, which is the more interesting and decisive and historically important case, is that they have exploited socialist dynamics, anti-bourgeois, anti-capitalist dynamics. They are not identical, and to be anti-bourgeois and to be anti-capitalist are not the same. They are two very different things. The theorist of capitalism was Marx, but the theorist of bourgeoisie was Walter Benjamin. These are two different things, of course linked, but obviously, because bourgeoisie is a ruling class in a capitalist society, nevertheless, bourgeoisie had its own history and cultural history and its own culture and its own life world, which was annihilated both by Leninism, Stalinism, and by fascism. The bourgeois society is dead, and capitalist society lives on. You don't have, the Balzac to Proust style bourgeois society today. The bourgeoisie as a culturally determinant force doesn't exist any longer. For this, you have the intelligentsia. And yes, the bourgeoisie is supplanted as a cultural force by a successor class, which is the intelligentsia, which is quite different. And politically, it is the political apparatus, it is the capitalist state, and technocracy and corporate management and so on. I mean, not the owners. The directions are established by engineers, that is intellectuals, and designers, and technocrats, and bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. So the greatest achievements of fascism, the great idea of fascism, a capitalist society steered and dominated by non-bourgeois apparatchiki, has won. But what is the difference between classical fascism that ended, of course, in the Second World War and in Auschwitz? What's the difference today? Why is not contemporary fascism sanguinary? Why is not bloody? Why am I not in prison? It's very simple. Because the socialist workers' movement is dead. That's why. The enemy doesn't exist. Fascism has won the great battle. It has lost Germany. It has lost external political power, but its world historical mission, as it was understood by Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler, and by Benito Mussolini, in this they were not different, in many other things they were different, but not in this, that their mission was to annihilate socialism. And this has happened. And it would not have happened without fascism. Communism was not defeated by liberal democracy or anything like that. It's nonsense. It was transformed into something, the Second World War and all that, has transformed the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc states and so on in apparatuses that, of course, have kept their own version of state capitalism up, and they were egalitarian, anti-bourgeois and anti-capitalist states in which the basic determinants of capitalist society, commodity production, wage labor, and money, continued to exist, as everybody here coming from Eastern Europe knows only so well, right? Now, so therefore, the rebirth of some elements of fascism, obviously not all. You don't need SS, you don't need the quadristi, you don't need SA, you don't need, even, coup d'etat like, the Pinochet coup d'etat was in Chile, etc. So you don't need all that. How do the new post-fascist leaders come into power? By elections. Well, they don't need coup d'etat. Bolsonaro didn't need to have a coup d'etat in Brazil, and so on and so forth. And, okay. So therefore, the death of the socialist workers' movement was exactly as it was designed by the fascists, because they had to make a coalition with the bourgeois forces. It was Britain and the United States and France that were the allies of the Soviet Union. And the French Communist Party and the Italian Communist Party and the left and all these countries had to make a compact with the forces of the democratic bourgeoisie. And it is very interesting that the program of the Popular Front has been announced at the same moment when the Moscow trials have taken place. Because, of course, for this term to be made by Stalin, they needed to execute the old guard of the Communist Party, obviously. And I didn't say that it was planned that way, but it was a very important coincidence. And so you see, the socialist dynamics used by fascism was used not only to suppress the workers' movement, which was mercilessly exterminated, don't forget, but also to suppress parliamentary democracy and all that. Parliamentary democracy is the supreme form of the traditional rule of the bourgeoisie. Parliamentary democracy has always was to the advantage of the middle classes, not necessarily to high finance and to the real top draw of the financial aristocracy and so on and so forth, but it was to the middle bourgeoisie. And that has been indeed annihilated by fascism, and its very weak, very feeble rebirth after the Second World War was again thanks to this very precarious balance between the Soviet bloc and the West. Mutual deterrence, etc., etc., third world revolutions and so on and so forth has kept the West disciplined. Some of the most important causes of the welfare state to be realized in the 50s, 60s and 70s in the West was, of course, again the fear of a socialist transformation, both in the third world and maybe also in the West. The last real fascist style politics we had was in Italy. It was in Italy from 69 to 77, where with the cooperation of the Communist Party, the bourgeois establishment and the Italian state fought the insurgency, what is called nowadays the extreme left, and so it was not so extreme. It was not so extreme and it was not marginal. It was indeed, this is why they're called mostly operaisti, although they weren't the only ones to fight. But there was a struggle by the quite old-fashioned Italian working class against the powers of the old, the church, the bureaucratic state, the decentralized, old-fashioned and weak Italian state. And the Italian state needed the collusion of the Communist Party, of the Mafia and the Christian democracy and the Catholic Church in order to stabilize Italy and to kill off the insurgency. And this is why it had a distinctly fascist flavor. But that was a provincial a side, a battle. But real fascism doesn't need to exist. It was always the case after the Second World War in backward countries. Its rebirth now, of course, is caused by many things. But of course it's not the same. I must emphasize that there is no classical fascism without a revolutionary workers' movement. It has no sense. It has no point. Nevertheless, some of the conceptual elements to which I return of fascism survive, or they have been resurgent. Namely, the idea that why is Carl Schmitt so popular? Because again, the problem of the sovereignty of a given state to decide about citizenship has been so crucial. Partly because of the rise of racially alien minorities, the blacks in many places, and of course immigrant populations of various kinds. I won't go into detail, which you are familiar with. The immigrants and old immigrants and various groups of this kind, where the idea of a difference between human rights and civic rights reappears. Where the Enlightenment idea of universal citizenship, as described by Immanuel Kant, is questioned again, but is questioned in a different and interesting way. Because you see, history is so odd that actually the Kantian idea of universal citizenship has been accepted by the international legal superstructure after 1945, the cooperation of America, of Britain, of France, and of the Soviet Union. You know who was the man who actually was active in formulating in San Francisco the basic declaration of the United Nations? It was none else but Wyszynski, the state prosecutor of the Moscow trials in 1937. He was a good old Catholic Polish lawyer who knew his stuff. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Charter, and the endless documents of this kind that followed, Helsinki Declarations, European Compacts, etc., 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 endless. These are all representing what Immanuel Kant has described in Perpetual Peace as a republican order. He said that, a perpetual peace, that is a universal condition of full-fledged citizenship for everybody, can be realized only if all states are republican, in his sense that constitutional states in which supreme law will secure the rights of everybody to achieve and to keep citizenship, and the completeness, the fullness of rights that exist at the time. This, of course, like always, these things are hypocritical. Of course, these promises for humankind, of course, weren't kept. Nevertheless, this is the basis of recognition of a given state as a full-fledged member of the international community. And this was, why did the Soviet Union sign the Helsinki Agreement, thereby creating dissident groups within the Soviet Union? Because they didn't have any other idea. Because the idea of the universal citizenship, the Enlightenment idea, the great idea of the bourgeois revolution, was also their idea. They couldn't say no to something they officially believed in. How could they? But now, so they were hypocritical. So the Soviets were lying. But the new powers, the new post-fascist powers, are not lying. They are declaring openly they are not subscribing to international republican order. That indeed racial differences or ethnic differences or cultural differences, name it as you wish, are constitutive of civic rights or the absence of such. And all this new racism and anti-immigrant madness and so on and so forth are basically not only madness, as it's described usually by liberals, that is so also irrational and so on. Yeah, well, of course, political passions are as irrational as any other passion, but we are not talking only about passion, we are talking about statecraft. We are talking about statecraft, we are talking about politics. And politics is not wholly irrational. It can be self-contradictory, it can be, crazy, looked at from some points of view, but that is only the surface. What is the consequence of the withdrawal of recognition from international law that happens today with a great speed from the United States withdrawal from various international treaties, by Great Britain leaving the European Union, by the general unraveling of the whole international construction based on an Enlightenment conceptual mythology, if you wish. This is based on a rehabilitation of biopolitical struggle, a biopolitical counter-revolution, pre-emptive revolution, that was first invented, of course, by the National Socialists. National Socialists said that our enemy is not socialism, our enemy is the Jew. And here Hannah Arendt, by no means my favorite thinker, had a very important point, but it was a common sense point and not a theoretical point. It was made by an extremely intelligent woman, not by a great philosopher. She said, the Communist Party of Germany explained anti-Semitism in the Third Reich as a device of misleading the proletariat. But for this they didn't need to kill 5.5 million Jews. That's not true. It wasn't a trick. They believed it. They believed it, and it was very important. And it was real. They really thought that socialism, and there's a grain of truth in it, not much, but some, that socialism was basically an alliance between the proletariat and the Jewish intelligentsia. Some of this, of course, was the case. And, of course, intellectuals coming from a marginalized and peculiar situation, of course, were more amenable to participate in revolutionary movements than others. Minorities have always participated in revolutions, not only the Jews, but also many others. For example, in the Middle East, all the leaders of revolutionary parties were Christians. Members of the Syrian Orthodox Church and Copts in Egypt and so on and so forth. In Romania, from where I come, the leaders of the Communist Party were Hungarians. It was a Hungarian party in Romania. You can imagine how popular that was. And because it was an internationalist party, so minorities, of course, were attracted. Okay. And it is today the biopolitical struggle against the biopolitical enemy, against the racial enemy, is serious. It is serious. The offense on the Hungarian-Serbian border is not symbolic. It is keeping out thousands of people. And so on and so forth. People are actually really dying in the Mediterranean. It is not symbolic. It is not only in order to mislead the voters in, West European. Well, that's useful for that too, but it is actually attacking their universal citizenship by non-recognizing international law, because, the treatment of refugees is in principle regulated by valid international law. That all the major states today, including the so-called liberal states in the EU, are refusing to comply with. Absolutely. And so they're, and they are hypocritical, and some people, like some East European states, I won't mention any concrete states, but you can guess, right? I'm just joking. I'm not afraid of mentioning Hungary. And, but you see, the thing is that they are sincere and the Westerners are less so. But the situation is again very grievous, where threats of class struggle, which is of course class struggle must be generalized at this day and age, again as a struggle for subaltern human groups, including of course women and including disadvantaged ethnic groups too. They are turning against the hierarchy of societies as they are. And this must be transformed into a biopolitical and racial war between people who will submit to the misrecognition of universal citizenship and republican order in order to keep the present hierarchy in place. This is why it is, again, a preemptive revolution. And since the 20s, we have a permanent counter-revolution, the symmetrical opposite of Trotsky's idea. But the counter-revolution has been more permanent than the revolution, and it proved more resilient and more tenacious, because of course it had all the power of capitalism at its fingertips. There may be individual bourgeois who are against all this, but that's just not important. And also, of course, this coincides, the great changes today, they coincide. There's this cyclical thing between liberal and pro-market eras of capitalism, protectionist and etatist and nationalist eras. There's a permanent change between the two since the early 19th century, as explained by Karl Mannheim and Karl Polanyi. And now we are entering a post-neoliberal era in which, of course, protectionism, nationalism, and statism are more and more important. From my point of view as a Marxist, of course, both are the enemy. So that's very characteristic of the contemporary left, that some are preferring this version of capitalism and others are preferring the other version of capitalism. The anti-neoliberal and the anti-extreme right sections of the left, and they don't understand that they are manifestations of the same thing, which is capitalism. Of course, different phenomena that should be treated differently if they are different, but nevertheless, both are the enemy. And anyway, but the biopolitical counter-revolution continues. The methods are by necessity not so violent, because, of course, the world order, meaning the capitalist world order, is not threatened. The political world order is threatened. We don't have that kind of international equilibrium and balance we had under the Cold War. Cold War has indeed wonderfully concentrated people's mind to behave reasonably, because the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and other yes, that's the main thing, but also they had their influence. The Soviet Union and China had their influence in the third world and so on and so forth. So there was a balance of forces, precarious but still. But of course the late communist parties and socialist bloc didn't challenge the world order. They were helping to keep it. It was a balance of forces, which is in some respects better than no balance at all, because of course no balance leads to chaos. And so the liberation in 1989 has indeed inaugurated this period of chaos, of lack of balance, that was kept by the Soviet-type dictatorship in place, but not in order to realize world communism, but in order to keep the status quo as it is. That was a conservative force. And since the neoconservative turn in America, the West was more innovative and more revolutionary than the East. Of course, in a nasty way, but still. And so you see, when I'm saying that when I'm asking the question, is there or was there fascism after 1945? The answer, of course, the simple answer is yes and no. But basically, I think that the stress falls on the yes. Why? Why? Because you see, we are all today, even the enemies of us, are following the logic of the biopolitical and the cultural war. What are we doing here today? What are we doing here? Dear comrades, what are we doing? We are following the lead of capitalist society in concentrating our combat on culture. That's it left. I'm not blaming you or myself. This is the terrain that has been left to us, and this is the terrain we are absolutely certain to lose. Not necessarily to Orban-style dictators. That's a provincial phenomenon. And pretty unpleasant, let me tell you. But it's a provincial phenomenon. We will lose the cultural war to commodification. Obviously, to commodification through the new networks that are developing. I won't need to tell you about those because you will be told by people more knowledgeable about them than I am in the weeks to come. And so that's one. And again, so what am I doing as a politically active citizen in my own country? What am I protesting against? Against homophobia, against heterosexism, against racism, against anti-immigration drives, against chauvinism, ethnic, racial, biopolitical topics, all. Am I giving up on the class struggle? Well, not in principle, but am I giving it up in the practice? Certainly. Why? Because I can't do anything else. That's why. Because that's the only territory left to us. Who wants to overturn the system of capitalist production, property, technology, labor, money, the state? Nobody. Nobody. We don't have revolutionary forces. And so therefore, this is a rearguard action, a defense of a restricted territory by a beaten army that has abandoned its best position in the world historical struggle. And that is, to a very important, not only, but to a very important respect, a partly posthumous victory of fascism. Okay? So, if you think that you knew how tragic the situation is, you are mistaken. The situation is much more tragic than you were thinking. Maybe. Because you see, it's not only that we are beaten, but we are beaten by the worst forces in history. We're not beaten by bloody liberal democracy. Where is that? That is totally adulterated, falsified, and if I were a liberal today, I would be disgusted by its remnants that are really just a lie. They were suspected to be a lie even when they weren't. There were left-wing radicals in the 19th century that even then thought that Parliament was just, a facade. There was nothing serious going on. Oh, well, God, it was so much more serious than it is today. And so much more important issues were really decided by elections than they are decided now in elections. And, now you can have, you can choose between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Well, congratulations. So you see, the thing is that we are in a situation continuously since June 1848, when the first proletarian socialist revolution took place in Paris, at least from that time, in which the task, that is liberation from reification and from alienation, is the task of humankind, if you want me to talk like a Goethe-age old German philosopher. Why not? It's a nice language, which I would like to speak if I may, but of course I can't, because many things have changed. But the mission of liberationist movements was to transform society in which the old suffering caused by hierarchy and by physical labor will be suppressed, and in which a real rebirth of soul and body will happen. That's our task. That task hasn't changed, but it seems to be more distant than at any point of time before. And therefore, the active forces of today are on the right. And for example, that's of course, just to give you a little comic relief, there is an internet journal in Hungary, 888.hu, that has it as its subtitle, with great characters. It says, "We are the opposition," in the smaller characters, "to George Soros." And this is a government journal, the pro-government journal, but it's sponsored by the state. But they believe this very seriously, because they think very much like the 1920s. People like they were in the circle around the review Tart, Ferdinand Fried and these people, it's pre-fascists, Ernst Jünger and others, that they are against the establishment, because they still imagine that the establishment is the liberal establishment, because the liberal establishment appears in the media and it appears as being powerful, although it has no power whatsoever. And it has some sort of rhetorical success in some circles, obviously, and especially, and let me just tell you a few words in mitigation and also to close my remarks about cultural Marxism, especially as it is today, 50 years from the death of Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno. It is today, the anniversary. He died 50 years ago, in 1969, after having had a heart attack after his quarrels with the leftist students. He just died of heartbreak. That's basically what happened, and a very important kind of heartbreak. Okay, so why are people in the alt-right, these groups, Steve Bannon and such, calling their enemies cultural Marxists? They are being very exact, very precise, because the terrain of Marxism, the field of Marxism in which it fought, was the battlefield. The factory, the trenches, the fields, the cultivated fields, the organization, the state, and the important philosophical and moral decisions people had to take, as it has been already described by Dostoevsky. I mean, this is not something that you don't know about. Obviously, it was already felt by Dostoevsky, and rightly so, that radical Russian revolutionaries were against God. Yes. Of course, that's a metaphor. Nietzsche was also against God, no, wasn't he? Because he was also a reader of Dostoevsky, one of the great discoverers of Dostoevsky in Germany. He read Dostoevsky in French translation, didn't exist yet in German, and he couldn't read Russian. And you see, the great revolutions of the 19th century were, of course, against God in a very specific sense, in the sense of the metaphysical guarantor of the world order that separated priest from layman, where the power of the keys were given to the church. The Grand Inquisitor. I mean, these are, well-known contents of European culture and of world culture, of whatever kind. The keys that were in the hands of the priest. So therefore, the difference between the spirit and the body was declared being absolute. And if that difference is being kept, liberation is not possible. If the laborer is inferior to the scholar, to the priest, to the magician, to the politician, to the warrior, then no liberation is possible. So Dostoevsky, and also Tolstoy, who was of course a revolutionary Christian, and the other was a counter-revolutionary Christian, knew perfectly well that the question was, do we keep hierarchical society or not? And hierarchical society is being kept alive by the capacity of modern capitalism to transform class struggle into biopolitical and cultural struggle. It still depends on that. So the alt-rights accusing us, as it were, the left, of being cultural Marxist. Can you imagine Karl Marx reading this? That some people can be cultural Marxists? So what has happened to economics? What has happened to politics? What has happened to warfare? Okay? That meant that also the right knows perfectly well how weak we are. And they want to defeat us even in that remaining little field of the culture. And they hope that the new digital culture and hyper-digital whatever will be their new battlefield in which to win, in which the real friends of the people, the real friends of the subaltern populations, the real friends of the exploited, of the oppressed, are called the elite. It is not the rich, it is not the powerful that are called the elite. It is, penniless people such as myself who are called the elite. Obviously. Because we, of course, represent also a heritage. The liberationist heritage also that has, of course, a long past. There's a long past. That the intimation of communism, they are there in Plato, they are there in Christianism. I'm finished. And so therefore, the last battle about to take place, and we are unarmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaspar. Thank you so much. Maybe just...
I can't say that it was my pleasure. I'm about to cry. Yeah.
Okay. Just to offer a short break, to simply introduce myself in this context, in this school, collaboration with Stacion. Some 6-7 years ago, Albert Keta heard of my project of interviews with Kosovo Serbs, because I understood that we people from Belgrade or from the rest of what was once Serbia really didn't know anything about Kosovo and were very affectionately connected to the question, etc. And whom else to ask than Kosovo Serbs? What is Kosovo? How is the situation? What happened there out of this media manipulative sphere that was mostly at our disposal. So when he heard about that, he offered me to do a project of interviewing Kosovo Serbs in the northern Kosovo, in Mitrovica, Zvečan, Zubin Potok. And I went there, and when you can check the interviews there on Stacion's website, But when he was listening for some of them, I suppose, he asked me, but why do you discuss Second World War issue with people there in the interviews? And he said, but I mean, it's there. I mean, if it is about contemporary fascism, it is about fascist or fascist practice in the wars and all the atrocities in the 90s. I mean, we just cannot skip their historical connections, origins, etc. And this is why in our program we have titles like How Fascism Comes into Existence or How Fascism Should or Could Disappear. And this is why we were happy to host Gaspar and to have one of his really brilliant lectures. So, I have two Swiss questions, and then you can ask Gaspar related to this lecture or many of his very interesting ideas and thoughts. My first question would be: could we connect the several questions or several categories that you mentioned as a precondition for, let's say, liberation, social, economical, political? Like getting rid of the state, getting rid of consumership, getting rid of labor, getting rid of entire system that we live in and pretty much own our understanding of existence. Is it something that could be compared or framed with what Marx saw as human emancipation versus political emancipation in his famous text on Jewish question? So that would be first. And just to add that also related to this list, since you are, I don't know, I'm not some very, very exact follower of all leftist theoreticians and activists, but as far as I know, you are the only one that once said that you are ready to join any ambitious emancipatory movement of today that would have a goal of changing this system radically. I read that somewhere. So is this change represented in these several categorical demands? In fact, getting rid of capitalist way of production, of reproduction, of life as it is for us today. That would be my question.
Okay, I'll start with the second one. This is slightly misunderstood. I didn't maybe express myself very clearly. I said in that interview that the fact that I'm radical in some respects doesn't mean that I'm against some moderate reformist attempts to improve people's station in life. That would be absurd. Also, it would be immoral. So of course, any improvement will do in a pinch. Of course, that's not it. I don't think that moderate social democracy liberalism can solve anything. But if even temporarily, some people can see their salaries increased, their holidays prolonged, their health care improved, they have my blessing and they have my support. Obviously, that's all what I meant. And I don't think that is conducive to the radical change we need if we don't want to perish miserably. Because you see, the old thing, the old saying of socialism or barbarism, that actually Rosa Luxemburg only quoted from the old Engels, who was not a utopian thinker or a mindless radical. He was quite a pragmatic, good-humored bourgeois. So now, of course, we can add to this socialism or barbarism, and socialism or death by heat and fire. And where capitalist society is reaching its physical limits, and it was always bound to reach these limits. It has been predicted long ago, and so therefore, I don't think that any raising of salaries and improving the social situation of some strata will solve these basic problems. But of course, that doesn't mean that that we should neglect, opening new kindergartens. Yes, we have also those daily tasks that are our moral obligations, but we shouldn't fool ourselves about the chances that these measures and these steps will mean in the history of humankind. So, informed pessimism is being called for. But to respond to your first question, again, briefly, so is there any visible foundation for human emancipation as we find our contemporary world? Well, no. It is, if you are really, really serious about the tradition of critical theory as it started with Marx. I don't mean Marxism in the narrow sense. We must realize that chances of such momentous social changes are linked to history. So after the socialist promises being A, betrayed, B, defeated, in what particular order, God knows. And so I can't say in any responsible and reasonable way that the chances are the same as they were in 1844 and 1843 when these writings of Marx materialized, when he was young. And so when he was a reader of Hegel, a reader of Adam Smith, but also a reader of Friedrich Schiller. And so you see, the chances for human emancipation are very slim. It's not because the movement, not only because the movement is defeated, but because as a result of these defeats, this hope or this utopia, name it as you wish, has been put on a back burner, as indeed Adorno, to remember him again, has realized and written. The famous phrase that philosophy is becoming actual because the moment of its realization has been missed. There's the famous quotation from the preface to the Negative Dialectics. Yes. So it is when Marx said that this problem from a philosophical problem becomes a practical problem. Thesis from Feuerbach, right? So now this is from a practical problem becomes a theoretical problem again. So what we are talking about is philosophy, well, not in the sense of the academic philosophy, of course, necessarily, but necessarily that, but philosophy in the traditional sense of being contemplation as opposed to activity. That's all I mean. So this is a situation in which we find ourselves. But it's not bound to remain so indefinitely, but most certainly I cannot see any promising exit from it. That's maybe my limitation.
That's fair.
Yes.
Waiting for this question.
Right.
Hello. Hi, my name is Unai Dari. I'm a journalist, and I'm very glad to be here tonight, especially because one of the topics that I cover a lot is, of course, what is being called the populist wave in Europe. And I completely agree with everything you said today, and this is something that I have a difficulty explaining to my Western colleagues, that the motivations for, or what propelled sort of like these right-wing forces in Western Europe and in post-socialist Europe are very different. They tend to group, academics such as Schmitt and others tend to group populism into the same bucket. Populism in Poland is the same as populism in France or in the United Kingdom.
It is.
But you said that in Western, if I understood it correctly, in Western Europe, one of the main reasons for populism appearing is the disappearance of socialist enemy that they had to live up to, or that they had to compete with. Whereas in Eastern Europe,
It's the same thing.
well, it's the disappearance. No, but isn't it in Eastern Europe the antagonism towards the socialist enemy? Isn't it primarily anti-communist and anti-socialist, and then...
But we are the communists. That's not no enemy. It's just an image of an enemy.
Then my question is, if you were to fight this phenomenon, both in Eastern and Western Europe, would the approach be the same or different?
Listen, I wrote an article for Open Democracy, where you may know that.
Yeah.
That says that populism doesn't exist.
I agree with the term populism.
Yeah, but that's just a word. I know what you mean. Yes, basically, I think that of course there are differences, like always, between rich countries and poor countries, and countries with different histories. So, nevertheless, the parallels are much more intriguing than the differences. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, you have the same drive against the elites and the establishment as you are witnessing in the United States. Exactly the same thing, without the slightest, not even a difference of nuance. It's the same thing. And the same distaste for intellectuals, the same distaste for theory, the same distaste for high culture, etc., etc., etc. And also with the added complication in the case of Eastern Europe, that many people, of course, will identify the communist idea with the local tyrant, tin pot tyrant of du jour, you know. I mean, and that of course gives that's a great opportunity for the right there, you know, to point. Well, of course, they're very unlucky with me, because of course before '89 I was a dissident, so they can't point at me that he's a former communist, because he isn't. I mean, but that's just me. You know? So but this is totally marginal. Really, the difference is, you know, we came to a point in which that's what is called a world historical moment, when the whole heritage of the Enlightenment, from communism to the most hidebound old-style democratism, are dying together, while hating each other, but dying together. Well, that was always the case in all the great concentration camps of yesteryear, when, you know, communists hated social democrats hated liberals, and they went all together to the gas chambers. Okay, we are not going to the gas chambers. There won't be any gas chambers, I hope. No, I don't think so, actually. But it's a world historical moment in which the differences are really becoming secondary. What is the essential difference between Narendra Modi and Trump and Bolsonaro and Orban and this and that and the other?
But there is a difference between
Yes.
Modi and
Yes, of course.
With Modi, and this is specifically what I'm going at, these are countries, I feel that journalists, so I'm criticizing my own kind, do not recognize the fact that in countries that escaped feudalism or they were less developed before the onset of any sort of socialist form of society, they now retreat to a form of pre-social society that, in case of Modi, who's reversing Nehru's legacy of having the dominant role, having what they never had in colonial periods. Having one ethnic group be the dominant ethnic group in the country and shaping the political sphere through that. I feel that it's very different from Western Europe because...
Why? Why? It's the same thing.
Okay, so
about the dominant ethnic group, no?
Well, Western European populist, whenever, I'm sorry for taking so much time, this is my last question, Marine Le Pen would never, in a speech, even though that's kind of what she's saying, directly target the Communist Party of France or the Socialist Party of France. But Kaczynski in Poland will talk about communists as the main enemy.
Of course.
Poroshenko will talk about communists as the main enemy, as will Orban and everyone else.
It's not important. I don't think it's important.
I thought...
It's just local variations. Look, your French Communist Party doesn't exist.
Not also true.
And the Indian Communist parties do. So yeah. So yeah, of course there are differences. Of course, I don't say that Indians are the same as Germans. Of course not. Still, but these forces of the right are conspicuously similar in emphasizing the ethnic and the racial thing, as opposed to
But should the solution be the same?
sorry?
So should the solution be the same? If you were to fight against it, you can't fight Western populism and Eastern populism the same way, let's say.
I think so, that you can, yeah. Yes.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Yes. Yes. But we won't. No. Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is very short and very simple. I would want to know what you think that cultural workers and artists should be doing right now. So, like, is now the time to put that on the back burner and,
Yes.
and become,
No.
I don't know, I mean, in my case, I suppose a union organizer, but
We should become
I'm all for going down in a dignified way. So defend your territory, fund new institutions, write new books, try to convince and to delight your audiences. Do what you can. My idea of your chances are not very optimistic, but doesn't mean. But the obligations don't change. The duties are do what you can. Do what you can. Don't be discouraged. There's no hope. So what? So what? So no. You shouldn't retreat into passivity and giving up struggling, because it's also about your own dignity and also about your own fun.
well, no, if I can just follow up. So I'm not talking about giving up struggling, I'm talking
Yes.
about diverting struggling elsewhere, to doing something other than, I guess, what we have been trained to do.
Yes.
Would you suggest that?
Yes. Well, in the absence of perspective, of a world historical change. I mean, I'm really talking seriously, because there are serious problems, and also for all of us, existential problems as well.